I had dedicated a quarter of a century of my life to this company. 25 years. Every promotion, every late night, every personal sacrifice was in service of one goal: building something that mattered, leaving a mark and earning respect. I thought I had it all: the corner office, the trust of my team, and the admiration of my peers. But little did I know, respect and admiration are fragile things when they meet greed and deception. I remember my first day like it was yesterday. Bright-eyed, a fresh graduate, clutching a folder filled with dreams and ambition. The CEO at the time, Jonathan Myers, walked me through the corridors of the glass-walled office like I was part of some sacred mission. He had that rare combination of charisma and sharp intellect that could either inspire or terrify you. Most days, it was inspiration. On those rare days when he scowled, you felt like the entire company's weight had fallen on your shoulders. But I loved that intensity. It pushed me to be better, faster, smarter, and I thrived under it. Over the years, my work spoke for itself. Projects that were considered impossible became triumphs under my guidance. I was the one who stayed late to troubleshoot, the one who negotiated impossible deals, the one who knew the company's operations inside out. My office walls were cluttered with plaques, awards, and framed photos of milestone events, company anniversaries, product launches, charity galas. Every corner reminded me of years of dedication, and yet none of that mattered anymore. It started subtly. Jonathan's personal life began bleeding into the office. There was laughter too loud for conference rooms, whispers by the coffee machine, glances exchanged that didn't belong in a professional environment. Then came Emily, the young assistant hired seemingly overnight. Beautiful, ambitious, always at Jonathan's side, learning fast, smiling wider than she should. Everyone assumed she was just another ambitious newcomer. I assumed she was harmless. I should have known better. But the first real red flag appeared during a quarterly meeting. Emily had been asked to prepare a report, a routine task, yet she presented it as though she had orchestrated the entire project herself. Jonathan clapped the loudest. "Excellent work, Emily," he said, his tone a mix of pride and something I couldn't quite place, something personal. I nodded politely, forcing a smile while my stomach twisted into knots. There was no way a young assistant could outperform decades of experience overnight. Or maybe there was. Maybe Jonathan had already made a decision I wasn't aware of yet. Over the next few months, the signs became impossible to ignore. Emily was everywhere Jonathan was. She attended high-level meetings. She received commendations. She smiled in a way that suggested she belonged in the spotlight. And me, I was still working, still loyal, still the backbone of the company, but increasingly invisible. I started noticing small changes. My suggestions being ignored in meetings. My project approvals delayed. My input questioned. Colleagues avoided eye contact when I walked in, as if they were silently bracing themselves for some inevitable announcement. I kept telling myself it was paranoia. "You've been here 25 years, I'd say. You know the CEO? You've earned this." But confidence has limits. And the more I saw Emily rise, the more I felt that creeping sense of dread. There were rumors, of course, rumors whispered in hallways, in the elevator, over half-empty coffee cups. The usual office gossip. But when a rumor aligns too closely with what you fear, it stops being just gossip. It becomes a knife twisting in your gut. I tried to confront Jonathan, indirectly at first. I asked questions during meetings, nudged projects toward my oversight, tried subtle reminders of my experience and loyalty. But Jonathan, ever charming, deflected with a smile and a pat on the shoulder. "You've been invaluable for years," he said. "We're just trying to innovate, you understand? Okay?" And I nodded, forcing the smile that masked the storm brewing inside me. I understood, all right? I understood betrayal. I understood injustice. I understood that everything I had worked for could vanish in a heartbeat. Outside the office, my life started to fray. Family dinners were interrupted by calls I couldn't ignore. Weekends became extensions of weekdays. I was living to work as I always had, but now with the gnawing sense that my work was slipping from my control. Friends would ask me why I seemed distant. I would shrug, forcing a laugh. It's just stress, I'd say. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was a premonition, a warning I couldn't yet fully articulate. And then came that Datha, one I had dreaded but had convinced myself would never happen. Jonathan called me into his office, that glass-walled cathedral where I had spent countless hours of my life, and for the first time I felt truly small. He was smiling, as always, but there was an edge, a certain satisfaction that made my stomach drop. "I've made a decision," he said, almost casually, like he was announcing the weather. "We're going in a new direction. Emily will be taking over your position." The words landed like a hammer. My mind froze, my voice caught, my hands clenched around the armrests of the chair. 25 years. Every achievement, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, replaced by his mistress. I managed a nod. "Congratulations," I said, my voice hollow. Jonathan didn't notice the tremor in my expression. He didn't notice the spark igniting inside me, the anger, the disbelief, the plan beginning to form in a mind honed by decades of experience. I left the office that day feeling as if I had been exiled from a kingdom I had helped build. But in that same instant, I realized something crucial. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. I walked out of that office, my career in ruins, but a new idea had already taken root in my mind, one that would make him regret ever underestimating me. I remember that morning as if the universe itself had conspired against me. The sunlight streamed through the office windows, bright and blinding, but I didn't notice it. My mind was trapped in a haze of disbelief and simmering rage. 25 years, lifetime of work, trust, and loyalty, all dismissed in the blink of an eye. And for what? A young woman who barely knew the inner workings of the company, who smiled her way into every boardroom meeting, and most infuriatingly was the CEO's mistress. The announcement had been quiet, almost casual. Jonathan didn't throw me out in a storm of shouting or dramatic confrontation. He didn't need to. The words themselves were enough to annihilate me. "Emily will be taking over your position." No warning, no discussion, no acknowledgement of my contributions. It's just those cold, merciless words. Colleagues avoided my gaze after that. Some whispered in corners, their eyes darting toward me as if I were a disaster waiting to happen. Others tried to offer condolences, awkwardly patting my shoulder. I couldn't decide which stung more, the betrayal itself or the pity that came with it. And then there was Emily, smiling in that office like she had earned it, oblivious to the storm she had stepped into. Or maybe she knew exactly what she was doing. I spent the next few days in a daze. Emails went unanswered. Calls went unreturned. The office seemed surreal, like I was moving through a film set where everything was familiar yet grotesquely distorted. My projects were reassigned, my assistants shuffled to other teams, and my inbox flooded with memos that felt like passive-aggressive reminders of my obsolescence. Every time I walked past the corner office, I saw Emily there, sitting in my old chair, typing with a smug sense of ownership that made my blood boil. I tried to rationalize it at first. Maybe it was just a phase, a temporary shakeup, a test of my patience. But then came the whispers. One afternoon, I overheard two board members in the hallway, voices low but deliberate. "She's inexperienced," one said, "but Jonathan seems enamored. Can't believe he actually put her in that position. He's cutting protagonist out completely." The other replied, 25 years, just like that. I wanted to intervene, to shout at them, to reclaim the dignity that had been stripped from me, but I couldn't. Not yet. I realized that anger untempered was a liability. I needed focus. I needed control. And I needed a plan. The first few weeks were torture. Every meeting, every interaction with Emily was a reminder of my displacement. She would ask questions, pretending to know what she didn't, repeating phrases I had crafted over years. She had Jonathan wrapped around her finger, and everyone else was too afraid or too opportunistic to challenge her. My old team looked at me with a mix of awe and sympathy, uncertain if they should speak or stay silent. It was during one particularly long meeting that I noticed the first real crack in Jonathan's armor. He had a presentation scheduled with investors. Emily standing beside him, she fumbled over the slides, hesitated on numbers, and yet Jonathan smiled at her, whispered encouragement, and covered for every mistake. But I noticed something the investors didn't tease something. Only someone who had built the company from the ground up could see. Sloppy projections, overlooked expenses, and small, dangerous financial missteps. A tiny, insidious seed of satisfaction took root. Maybe, just maybe, the man who had betrayed me wasn't infallible. Maybe the very arrogance that had allowed him to replace me so casually could become his undoing. But before I could act, the personal betrayal hit harder. One evening, I received an anonymous email. Someone had sent me a picture of Jonathan and Emily at a lavish dinner, laughing intimately, glasses raised. The timing, the secrecy, the deliberate flaunting, it wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about humiliation. I had been erased not for incompetence, not for failure, but because of lust, favoritism, and manipulation. For days, I couldn't focus. I replayed every conversation, every meeting, every project. I saw now how subtly Jonathan had been cutting me off, redirecting praise, highlighting flaws that were negligible, and positioning Emily in the spotlight. The betrayal was surgical. It wasn't obvious, it was cruel in its precision. Yet amidst the rage and despair, clarity began to emerge. If Jonathan had underestimated me once, he could do so again. If he believed his power was untouchable, he was dangerously naive. And if Emily's position rested entirely on favoritism rather than merit, then her fall could be orchestrated. Slowly, methodically, the concept of revenge transformed from a fantasy into a tangible plan. I began documenting everything. Emails, meetings, financial discrepancies, Emily's missteps, Jonathan's blind spots. Every detail mattered. Every subtle weakness could be exploited. And most importantly, I reminded myself not to act impulsively. Patience would be my ally, precision my weapon. The humiliation, the loss, and the betrayal were all burning inside me, but I learned to wear them as armor rather than let them consume me. The first taste of control came in private moments, correcting small errors Emily made, guiding projects anonymously, subtly undermining her credibility without revealing myself. The sweet sting of quiet power became addictive, a promise of what was possible. And yet, the most difficult part wasn't the anger. It was the disbelief. The people I had trusted, who had cheered me on for decades, who had shared late nights and early mornings, were now silent witnesses to my displacement. Some avoided me altogether, while others, still loyal to Jonathan, began to see me as a relic. I realized then the depth of isolation betrayal can create, and the subtle ways it reshapes reality. But in that isolation, I also found a hidden advantage. I was no longer accountable to the corporate hierarchy. I was invisible. And invisibility, I realized, could be the ultimate weapon. I had been replaced, humiliated, and betrayed, but as I watched them celebrate my erasure, I knew one thing. The man who thought he had destroyed me had no idea the storm I was about to unleash. The days following the announcement were a blur, a twisted blend of anger, disbelief, and helplessness. I went through the motions, attending meetings, signing memos, making appearances, but it was all mechanical. My mind kept replaying the humiliation on loop. Jonathan's casual smile. Emily seated in my old chair, the laughter echoing down the hallways. Every small reminder was like salt in a wound that refused to close. At home, it was no better. My family could see the tension in my eyes, the way my jaw clenched when I walked in the door. Dinner conversations were stilted. My spouse tried to offer comfort, but I couldn't stop the racing thoughts. Friends called with polite inquiries, carefully avoiding the subject of work as if saying my name could summon the betrayal itself. And I was too proud to admit the depth of the hurt. Pride, after all, had been my armor for 25 years. Without it, I felt exposed, vulnerable, unmoored. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, imagining every possible scenario in which I confronted Jonathan, exposed Emily, reclaimed my dignity. Rage surged and ebbed like waves, each crest leaving me breathless, each trough leaving me hollow. But even in this chaos, a dangerous clarity began to emerge. Anger alone would not be enough. Revenge required precision, patience, and meticulous planning. I had to resist the urge to strike impulsively. Otherwise, I risked losing everything I still had, the one advantage I could leverage: knowledge. In the office, things only worsened. Emily, emboldened by Jonathan's favoritism, started making decisions she clearly didn't understand. Minor errors accumulated: misjudged timelines, overlooked budgets, flawed projections. Jonathan, blinded by his infatuation, covered for her, praising her publicly while ignoring the warning signs. To the casual observer, she seemed competent, confident, untouchable. To me, she was a liability, and that realization sparked the first sparks of strategy. I began observing patterns. Jonathan had blind spots, predictable, arrogant, careless blind spots. He trusted loyalty in superficial ways, overlooked internal processes he deemed mundane, and assumed that years of experience made people subordinate to his whims. Every misstep, every weakness, every overconfidence could be cataloged, and I began doing exactly that. I quietly took note of financial decisions, board communications, email chains, even subtle interpersonal dynamics. At the same time, I had to contend with my own doubts. Moral questions haunted me. Was I becoming the very thing I despised: manipulative, calculating, vengeful? Would acting on this resentment make me a mirror image of Jonathan? I wrestled with these thoughts constantly, but the answer came in small, undeniable truths. Betrayal had been inflicted upon me. Injustice demanded action. And if I could turn my pain into strategy, I could ensure not just personal satisfaction, but also a poetic justice that would leave Jonathan reeling. My social interactions at work became a delicate balancing act. Colleagues treated me with a mix of awe and caution. Uncertain whether I had accepted my displacement or was quietly plotting something, I remained outwardly professional, offering guidance when asked, staying in the background, yet my mind was a storm of contingency plans. Every conversation, every interaction was a puzzle piece. Every observation, another brushstroke in a larger canvas of revenge. The emotional toll was immense. I felt the old adrenaline rush of high-stakes work, long gone, replaced now by a gnawing sense of vulnerability. Each day was a test of endurance. Every time Jonathan praised Emily publicly, a dull ache of humiliation spread through me, followed immediately by the quiet spark of anticipation. She was making mistakes, and he was blind to them. The balance of power was subtly shifting, even if he didn't realize it yet. Late one night, I found myself in the empty office, the glow of computer screens reflecting off the glass walls. I scrolled through years of reports, financial analyses, project timelines, internal memos. I could see patterns no one else noticed. Small inefficiencies, overlooked risks, subtle gaps in compliance. I realized that over 25 years, I had built a mental map of the company so detailed that Jonathan himself was blind to it. And if wielded correctly, this knowledge could topple him in ways he would never see coming. Yet, even as strategy crystallized, the emotional fallout continued. I felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration, guilt and vindication, anger and calm. The betrayal had fractured my identity, was no longer just the loyal employee, no longer just the mentor or the backbone of the company. I was something else entirely, an invisible force, patient and calculating, watching and waiting. The personal pain became fuel for the plan that was slowly forming in my mind. I started small, testing waters with subtle actions. A corrected error here, a quiet suggestion there, an unnoticed improvement to a project Emily was mishandling. Each small success reminded me that I still had power. I didn't need to confront Jonathan directly. He was already overconfident, already blind to my presence, already on the path toward his own undoing. Even with these small victories, the emotional storm was relentless. Rage bubbled beneath the surface, occasionally breaking through in moments of quiet reflection. Sleep continued to elude me, and I often found myself pacing the apartment, running scenarios over and over. I knew I couldn't rush this. Precision required patience. Timing was everything. And while the betrayal still hurt deeply, it also became a strangely motivating force, a reminder that I had been underestimated, and underestimated people, when calculated correctly, could exact devastation in ways the betrayer never imagined. By the end of the month, I had moved past despair. Acceptance was not forgiveness. It was the recognition that the only path forward was through strategy. I had to embrace the emotional fallout as a tool, converting anger and humiliation into clarity and cunning. My revenge would not be impulsive or petty, it would be meticulous, methodical, and undeniable. And as the office buzzed with Emily's rising confidence and Jonathan's smug oversight, I began to see the outlines of the storm I was about to unleash. I had survived betrayal, humiliation, and isolation, but now the real work began. I was no longer just a victim. I was a strategist, and every move I made would bring them closer to a reckoning they could never escape. By the time I entered my 4th month of emotional recovery, I had come to a critical realization. Anger alone would not dismantle Jonathan and Emily. Impulse would destroy me long before it reached them. I needed patience, strategy, and the kind of meticulous planning that only decades of intimate knowledge of a company could provide. Revenge would not be a single explosive act, it would be a series of calculated moves. A chess game in which I had already mapped every square. I started by cataloging everything. Every project I had ever touched, every financial report, every internal memo, every email chain, every conversation that could serve as leverage. I wasn't just preparing for retaliation. I was assembling the blueprint of the company's vulnerabilities. I needed to understand where Jonathan's arrogance had created blind spots, where Emily's inexperience had created cracks, and where I could manipulate events without drawing suspicion. The first step was observation. I became invisible in the office. I smiled, nodded, and appeared disinterested while mentally dissecting every interaction. Jonathan's patterns were clear to me now. He overestimated loyalty, underestimated skill, and overcompensated when he felt insecure. He trusted appearances over substance and often ignored written reports in favor of charisma-driven meetings. This would be his undoing. Next, I identified Ali's quiet ones, overlooked ones, people who had been marginalized by Jonathan's favoritism or by Emily's arrogance. Some were hesitant, others cautious, but all had grievances I could leverage. I didn't need a large army. I only needed a few key players who could provide insight or facilitate small but crucial maneuvers. Recruitment had to be subtle. No one could know my intent, not even the closest confidants. I approached each conversation carefully, framing suggestions as concern for the company's health rather than personal revenge. I also began monitoring Emily's work in painstaking detail. Every report she submitted, every presentation she gave, every minor mistake, nothing escaped my attention. I noted inconsistencies, overlooked data points, and misjudgments. I kept these observations in a private document, cataloged by date, severity, and potential impact. What seemed trivial to the casual observer was actually a collection of small vulnerabilities that, if exposed strategically, could trigger a domino effect. Financial oversight became my next focus. Jonathan had grown careless with the company's finances, trusting Emily and other junior staff to manage budgets and projections. I quietly tracked discrepancies, misallocations, and miscalculations. I cross-referenced reports against prior years, identifying patterns of waste, risk, and potential legal exposure. Each small anomaly became a potential weapon. Meanwhile, I refined my own mental discipline. Emotional volatility would be my greatest liability. I meditated, journaled, and rehearsed scenarios in my mind, anticipating Jonathan's potential responses to various provocations. I developed contingency plans, escape routes, and alternative strategies. In my mind, the plan became a living organism, adaptive, resilient, and relentless. I also considered the psychological dimension of revenge. Jonathan's greatest weakness was not finances alone, which is ego. Public humiliation, exposure, and the erosion of his carefully curated image could be as devastating as financial loss. Emily, too, was susceptible to the collapse of credibility. She had no foundation of experience or merit to stand on. By combining the exposure of incompetence with strategic, financial, and procedural revelations, I could orchestrate a collapse that would be both precise and devastating. Small trials preceded the larger strategy. I began subtly influencing decisions in the office, correcting errors anonymously, leaking minor inaccuracies in presentations, and nudging junior staff to question Emily's judgment. These actions were imperceptible to Jonathan but visible in the results. Small inefficiencies, awkward delays, and rising tensions within the team. Every micro-action was a step toward a larger collapse. I also began documenting potential allies outside the company: board members, investors, and advisors who were subtly growing frustrated with Jonathan's management style. Anonymous notes, hints of financial irregularities, and carefully worded concerns could plant seeds of doubt in their minds without revealing my involvement. Timing would be critical. Too soon, and it would be dismissed. Too late, and I might lose the opportunity. During this phase, self-doubt often crept in. Morally, was I justified? Could calculated destruction of someone's career, even after betrayal, make me anything more than vindictive? I wrestled with these questions daily, but I reminded myself of one undeniable truth. I had been wronged, humiliated, and strategically removed from a position I had earned through decades of loyalty and skill. What I was planning was not chaos for its own sake, was restoration of justice through precision. I also rehearsed the final stage in my mind, imagining the eventual exposure of Jonathan and Emily. I visualized the public and professional consequences: board members confronting Jonathan, media covering the scandal, Emily's incompetence revealed, employees' morale restored. The vision became a psychological lodestar, a motivator that kept me disciplined during tedious preparation. By the end of this planning stage, I had mapped everything: vulnerabilities, allies, contingencies, psychological triggers, and execution sequences. Every interaction, every decision, every casual observation contributed to a strategy that was patient, deliberate, and unstoppable. The betrayal that had once left me hollow was now my secret weapon. And yet, even with all this preparation, one thought haunted me. The plan would fail if Jonathan ever realized I was orchestrating it. One slip, one miscalculation, and everything: my reputation, my credibility, my chance for justice would be gone. The stakes were enormous, but I had no choice. The fire of betrayal had ignited a storm, and storms are not tamed by hesitation. I had the map, the allies, and the strategy. Every move had been calculated, but the moment of execution would be the ultimate test. One misstep, and it would all collapse, including me. With the strategy meticulously mapped, the next phase was execution. But subtlety was everything. The goal wasn't to rush. It was to chip away at Jonathan and Emily's fortress slowly, invisibly, while they remained blind to the forces undermining them. I had become a shadow in the office, present but unseen, active yet invisible. The first move was precision sabotage. I started small, almost imperceptibly. A spreadsheet Emily had prepared would accidentally omit key figures. A report she submitted for the board would contain minor inconsistencies, nothing catastrophic alone, but cumulatively enough to sow doubt. I never confronted her, never challenged her directly. The art of invisibility meant letting others notice the flaws without suspecting their source. Jonathan predictably covered for Emily in public. He smiled, complimented her confidence, and subtly shifted blame for small missteps onto junior staff. But I observed his every reaction carefully. The irony was delicious. The very favoritism that had elevated Emily was now creating the first fractures in her credibility. Board members were another battlefield. Through carefully constructed anonymous emails, strategic leaks, and innocuous suggestions, I began nudging them to pay attention to discrepancies in financial reporting and project progress. The goal was to make them question Jonathan's judgment without ever implicating myself. Every message had to be factual, subtle, and utterly convincing. In these early moves, patience was key to aggressive, and suspicion would fall on me. Too weak, and nothing would happen. Meanwhile, I remained outwardly calm and professional. To the casual observer, I was adjusting to my demotion, handling tasks efficiently, and mentoring junior staff with quiet dignity. But underneath the surface, every interaction was a calculated step, every word carefully chosen. I had to maintain the appearance of a loyal, reasonable employee while the storm gathered silently behind me. Emily, of course, began to falter under subtle pressures. She was young, inexperienced, and accustomed to walking through doors opened by charm rather than competence. Small mistakes multiplied. An overlooked budget line here, a miscalculated projection there. Jonathan's protective instincts initially shielded her, but as the errors accumulated, cracks began to appear. It was fascinating, almost cinematic, to watch hubris crumble piece by piece without touching it directly. I also introduced small operational changes under the guise of assistance. A minor adjustment to a reporting format here, a tweak to workflow efficiency there. These changes seemed innocuous, but had ripple effects, exposing Emily's lack of understanding of deeper systems. Every subtle maneuver was designed to make her appear unprepared, inefficient, and ultimately replaceable even in the eyes of Jonathan, though he wouldn't admit it yet. Outside of direct sabotage, I began strengthening relationships with quiet allies, longtime staff members, junior employees, and even a few board members who had grown weary of Jonathan's favoritism were approached carefully. I framed conversations around the company's health, best practices, and efficiency improvements, never revealing personal vendetta. These allies became crucial, providing insights, validating my observations, and ensuring that when the moment of execution arrived, I wouldn't be alone. By now, Jonathan was starting to show subtle signs of stress. Late nights in the office became more frequent, meetings ran longer, and there were moments when his usually unshakable composure faltered. He was still unaware of my orchestration, still confident that he controlled the narrative. But the first dominoes had fallen. The cracks were appearing where he least expected them, and my patience ensured that I remained invisible until the collapse was complete. At home, the emotional intensity was exhausting. The thrill of manipulation mixed with anxiety over possible detection kept me in a constant state of alertness. I practiced every scenario mentally. If Jonathan noticed discrepancies, how would I deflect suspicion? If Emily questioned my intentions, how would I remain untouchable? These rehearsals were tiresome but necessary. Precision demanded preparation, and I refused to let one mistake unravel decades of planning. Even in these early moves, moments of small victories gave me strength. A board member questioned a report Emily submitted, a misstep unnoticed by Jonathan but flagged internally. A junior staff member hesitated before implementing one of her flawed ideas because of subtle guidance I provided. Each micro-success reinforced the belief that the storm I had envisioned was possible. And yet, tension lingered like a tightrope over a canyon. One slip could expose my intentions. One unanticipated move could backfire catastrophically. I reminded myself constantly: patience, precision, invisibility. These early moves were the foundation for the climactic phase. and any deviation could cost everything I had worked for. The first dominoes had fallen, but the real reckoning was still to come. Jonathan's arrogance would be his downfall, but only if I timed to strike perfectly. The day of execution arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the calm before a storm. Years of planning, observation, and subtle manipulation converged into a single decisive moment. I had rehearsed it endlessly in my mind, every word, every movement, every ripple effect. Jonathan remained oblivious, Emily still intoxicated by her temporary power. And the office continued its ordinary rhythm, unaware that everything was about to unravel. I began by activating the financial component of my plan. Minor discrepancies I had been tracking for months were now brought to the board's attention anonymously. Carefully documented reports, complete with comparisons to historical data and legal footnotes, were delivered under the guise of concern for the company's health. Each document exposed Emily's missteps and Jonathan's blind favoritism, but framed in a way that appeared professional, impartial, and entirely objective. The reaction was immediate. Board members reviewed the reports with growing alarm, questioning details Jonathan had assumed were trivial. He responded defensively, his tone polished but strained, attempting to downplay the errors and reassure them of Emily's competence. But I had anticipated his arguments, predicting exactly how he would misrepresent facts, how he would stumble in explanations, and how the gaps in Emily's knowledge would become glaringly obvious under scrutiny. Simultaneously, I leveraged internal staff dynamics. Whispers that had once been subtle suggestions now gained traction as more employees became emboldened to question decisions. Junior managers hesitated to follow Emily's directives, while mid-level staff discreetly documented missteps and compiled evidence. The atmosphere shifted, the once harmonious office became a tense battlefield, and Jonathan remained unaware that I was the architect of this subtle chaos. Emily, meanwhile, began showing signs of panic. She had relied entirely on charm and favoritism to rise, and now the foundation beneath her was crumbling. A critical meeting came where she was required to present a major quarterly forecast. Every number she reported, every projection she offered, had been cross-referenced against my research. I had prepared a series of prompts that highlighted inconsistencies, allowing staff and board members to notice errors without my direct involvement. The cracks were widening, and Emily's confidence evaporated in real time. Jonathan's facade started to crack. He attempted to reassure everyone, to redirect focus. It's cover for Emily. But each effort only drew attention to the errors he had overlooked for months. The board's patience thinned, questions became pointed, and whispers grew louder. He realized, too late, that control was slipping from his hands. The very arrogance that had allowed him to replace me had now blinded him to his own vulnerabilities. The psychological tension was intoxicating. Watching him falter, knowing that I had orchestrated every step, was a rush that balanced between triumph and unease. I didn't gloat or confront. Invisibility remained my ally. Jonathan's downfall would be complete not because of a single act of vengeance, but because I had methodically engineered a series of irreversible events. Each domino fell in perfect sequence, each misstep compounding the last. The climax approached when the board convened for a special emergency session. I had ensured that all evidence, from financial missteps to procedural errors, was indisputable and organized. Jonathan attempted to defend himself, but his words faltered, credibility crumbling with each pointed question. Emily's incompetence was laid bare. Every gap highlighted in the documents I had anonymously supplied. Board members exchanged glances, whispers turned into murmurs, and the power dynamic shifted irreversibly. In the midst of this, a final move was executed, an unexpected revelation that tied several minor errors together into a major legal and financial liability. It was the culmination of months of subtle manipulation, invisible to everyone except me. Jonathan's expression changed from disbelief to horror as the reality hit him. His empire, once secure, now teetered on the edge of collapse. The $7.8 billion he had presided over was no longer untouchable, and the board had lost all confidence in his leadership. The psychological payoff was exquisite. Jonathan, once so self-assured, now floundered, unable to regain control. Emily, humiliated and exposed, attempted weak defenses that only highlighted her inexperience. Staff members who had once whispered anxiously now observed with quiet satisfaction, recognizing the truth of what had been unfolding behind the scenes. The humiliation was public, undeniable, and total. I allowed myself a private moment of satisfaction. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no dramatic flair. Just the quiet knowledge that decades of dedication, observation, and patience had culminated in a precise, stoppable reckoning. I had turned betrayal into strategy, injustice into opportunity, and invisibility into ultimate power. And yet, even in the midst of triumph, I remained vigilant. The final phase ensuring that Jonathan and Emily's downfall was irreversible required one last set of moves. Documents were finalized, final evidence was submitted to the board and legal advisors, and internal communications were adjusted to prevent any attempt at damage control. Every step had been rehearsed, every contingency accounted for. The execution was complete, yet perfection demanded that I remain hidden, calm, and invisible until the very last domino fell. By the end of the week, Jonathan had lost his authority. The board had installed interim management, and Emily had been quietly removed from her position. The empire that had once seemed untouchable was fractured, its leaders humbled, their credibility destroyed. All without a single confrontation, without revealing myself to the key players until the moment the collapse was undeniable. I had orchestrated the perfect storm, but the final reckoning was yet to come. Watching them fall was one thing, but feeling the true release of justice would be another. The moment of reckoning arrived with a quiet inevitability, like the final act of a long play, where every line, every gesture, and every whispered secret had led to this single scene. Jonathan had been blindsided, Emily had been exposed. And the once pristine image of power they had built over years was crumbling around them. And I, the invisible force that had orchestrated every domino, watched from the shadows, savoring the precision of it all. The board convened again, this time with the full weight of the evidence I had methodically compiled. Every financial misstep, every procedural oversight, every flaw in Emily's oversight was laid bare. Jonathan attempted to respond, his confidence a fragile facade, cracking under the relentless scrutiny. The questions came fast, precise, and unavoidable. Each question I had predicted, each answer I had foreseen it, was a symphony of consequences orchestrated to perfection. Emily fumbled through her defenses, her voice betraying panic. She had relied entirely on charm and proximity to power, and now the carefully constructed illusion of competence evaporated. The staff, once fearful, observed quietly, recognizing the truth without a word from me. The humiliation was exquisite in its inevitability, a reminder that temporary power built on favoritism and deceit is inherently unstable. Jonathan's arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable, became his greatest liability. He attempted to shift blame, to justify decisions that had long been irrational, to assert control over a situation that had already escaped him. But the board had the evidence, the clarity, and the legal leverage to act decisively. The $7.8 billion empire that had once seemed invincible was now exposed to scrutiny, public attention, and potential financial ruin. And Jonathan, the man who had once looked down on me with casual disregard, was powerless to stop it. In that moment, I realized the true power of invisibility and patience. Every subtle nudge, every small correction, every meticulously documented flaw had accumulated into an unstoppable force. I had not acted out of impulsive rage. I had acted with calculated precision. And now, as the house of cards collapsed, I could observe the fallout without exposing myself to danger or suspicion. The board's verdict was swift and uncompromising. Jonathan was relieved of his duties immediately. Emily was removed from any managerial responsibility, and interim leadership was installed to stabilize the company. Public statements framed the situation as a necessary restructuring, but internally the humiliation was undeniable. Jonathan's reputation, once untouchable, was tarnished. Emily's credibility, entirely dependent on favoritism, was destroyed. The psychological collapse was as complete as the financial and procedural one. The emotional release for me was profound. I allowed myself a moment of reflection, a silent acknowledgement of the storm I had created. This was not mere revenge, was justice, delivered with precision and foresight. I had converted betrayal, humiliation, and despair into strategic action, creating consequences that were both public and undeniable. The satisfaction was visceral, but measured, a quiet acknowledgement that years of loyalty and expertise had triumphed over arrogance and deceit. Even as the dust settled, the ripple effects continued. Staff members regained confidence, operations began to stabilize, and the company culture shifted toward competence rather than favoritism. The long-term damage to Jonathan and Emily was irreversible, a permanent reminder that manipulation and deception have consequences. And I remained invisible, the architect of the outcome, unrecognized publicly, but fully aware of the impact of every calculated move. In private, I allowed myself a quiet, personal triumph that required no recognition. The power of patience, invisibility, and meticulous strategy had achieved what direct confrontation could never have accomplished. I had not only orchestrated a downfall, I had ensured it was complete, comprehensive, and irreversible. Jonathan and Emily had underestimated me, and their miscalculation had sealed their fate. And yet, even in victory, I understood the fragility of human emotion. Revenge was not just about the fall of others, it was about the reclamation of one's own dignity, the restoration of balance, and the psychological release from the weight of betrayal. Watching Jonathan and Emily falter, I felt the tension, the humiliation, and the satisfaction intertwine, creating a complex emotional landscape that was both exhausting and exhilarating. As I walked through the office one final time before leaving for the day, the silence was deafening. Colleagues avoided Jonathan's and Emily's offices, whispering among themselves, sharing subtle glances of satisfaction and relief. The company, once held hostage by arrogance and favoritism, had been reclaimed, in a sense, for competence, fairness, and justice. And I, the invisible strategist, had delivered it. I had orchestrated the perfect downfall, yet in the quiet aftermath, I realized that true closure would not come from watching them fall, would come from reflecting on the journey, from understanding the lessons, and reclaiming my own life. The dust had settled, but the echoes of what had transpired lingered in every corner of the office. Jonathan and Emily were gone, their credibility shattered, and the company's culture had begun to heal from the scars of favoritism and arrogance. But even with the professional triumph complete, I found myself pausing to reflect not on the fall of others, but on the journey I had endured to reclaim my dignity. Betrayal is a peculiar thing. It is both immediate and enduring, a wound that lingers long after the initial cut. For months, I had carried the weight of being replaced, dismissed, and humiliated. Every meeting, every whispered conversation, every glance in the hallway reminded me of the injustice I had suffered. Yet it was precisely this pain that fueled the meticulous planning, the endless observations, and the quiet manipulations that led to the eventual downfall of those who had wronged me. Looking back, I understood the dual nature of revenge. On one hand, it is a response to injustice, a reclamation of power stripped away unfairly. On the other hand, it is a test of discipline, patience, and psychological insight. Revenge is not simply about causing harm. It is about restoring equilibrium, creating consequences that are precise, proportional, and unavoidable. My triumph was not a matter of luck or brute force. It was a matter of strategy, observation, and controlled execution over months. In the aftermath, I noticed subtle changes in the people around me. Colleagues who had once avoided confrontation now approached me for guidance. Junior staff members who had been timid found their voices, empowered by the reshaping of leadership. Even board members who had silently questioned Jonathan's judgment for years expressed cautious optimism about the company's future. It was clear that justice, when executed thoughtfully, has a ripple effect far beyond the immediate targets. Personally, the experience left me with a profound understanding of resilience. Betrayal can break a person, or it can forge them into something stronger, sharper, and more capable. I had felt despair, rage, and humiliation, but through patience, meticulous planning, and emotional control, those feelings were transformed into a tool for achieving justice. I realized that the most potent weapon against betrayal is not anger alone, but clarity of mind, knowledge of one's environment, and the ability to act with unwavering precision. Yet, reflection also brought clarity about boundaries. Revenge, while satisfying, must be balanced with ethics and self-preservation. I ensured that no innocent parties were harmed, that consequences were proportional, and that every step I took could withstand scrutiny. The satisfaction of witnessing Jonathan and Emily's downfall was not just about retribution, it was about fairness, balance, and restoring what had been stolen. Emotionally, the closure was profound. The weeks of sleepless nights, anxiety, and meticulous strategizing had culminated not in chaos, but in order. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, the emotional burden of betrayal replaced by the quiet pride of a well-executed plan. The office, once a place of subtle humiliation, now felt neutral, almost peaceful. For the first time in months, I could breathe without the shadow of anger clouding every interaction. The lessons of this journey extend beyond corporate politics. Life often places us in positions of vulnerability, where unfairness and betrayal are unavoidable. But it is our response, measured, thoughtful, and strategic, that defines the outcome. Patience, observation, and planning are not merely tools of revenge. They are tools of empowerment. By converting adversity into action, one can transform injustice into opportunity, humiliation into strategy, and loss into reclamation. I also learned the importance of invisibility. Power is often perceived in overt displays, shouting, confrontation. Dramatic gestures, but true influence frequently operates behind the scenes, subtle and unassuming. My ability to act without revealing my intent ensured that every move was precise, uncontested, and ultimately effective. This lesson is universal. Not every battle requires a public fight. Sometimes the quiet, strategic path yields the most decisive victory. As I walked past the offices of Jonathan and Emily, now empty, I felt a sense of finality. Their era of arrogance and favoritism was over, replaced by a culture of competence, fairness, and accountability. The empire that had once seemed untouchable had been reshaped not through chaos, but through careful, deliberate orchestration. And in that reshaping, I had reclaimed more than a position or reputation. I had reclaimed my sense of self, my dignity, and my peace of mind. Finally, I realized that the true satisfaction of this journey lay not in witnessing the fall of others, but in understanding my own resilience, intelligence, and capacity for strategy. Revenge had been a means, but self-discovery was the ultimate reward. I had faced betrayal, endured emotional turmoil, and emerged stronger, wiser, and unshakably confident in my ability to navigate both injustice and opportunity. Betrayal is inevitable, but defeat is optional. Patience, strategy, and emotional control can transform despair into power, injustice into opportunity, and humiliation into a quiet, undeniable triumph.